Lincoln's second inaugural address, the one he delivered on March 4th, 1865, near the very end of the Civil War, is one of the shortest inaugural addresses in American history. And yet, a number of scholars think this is Lincoln's greatest speech. This is a profound statement of philosophy, national purpose, even poetry. It is a short statement, but Lincoln begins by explaining why. He says, at the second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement somewhat in detail seemed fitting and proper. Now, at the expiration of 4 years, he writes, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of that great contest. And he's referring here to all of his public statements, not just annual messages, but public letters, occasional speeches. He did not give many addresses during the war, but he used public communication to help shape public opinion and improve the chances for success in the North. But he notes here that the progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hopes for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. They did not know for sure the war would be over soon, but they knew that the Confederacy was on the verge of collapse. They knew that Northern armies had captured Atlanta, marched to the sea, and were now destroying the Carolinas coast, chasing after the Confederate armies. They knew that General Grant was on the verge of driving General Lee's army out of Richmond and sending them into the hills. There was no guarantee, but the prospects for Northern success seemed as good as ever. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, Lincoln wrote, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. Here is actually a statement of interest for those who argue over what caused the war. Lincoln himself is about to address it. He says, all dreaded it, this civil war, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. He says both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. Lincoln is not prone to blame other people, but in these two sentences, he makes clear there is a moral difference, in his opinion, between North and South, between Union and Confederate. And then he addresses the question of the underlying causes of the conflict. 1/8 of the whole population, he writes, were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. He said these slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest, and all knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. Here is Abraham Lincoln saying slavery was the cause of the Civil War. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Now, you know, critics of Lincoln would not see it this way, but this is how he presented his case. He argued time and again that he was willing to accept the existence of slavery, at least temporarily, in the states where it was, but by containing it, he expected its ultimate extinction. He expected white Southerners to abolish it voluntarily over time. He then turns to the war itself. He says, neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict, meaning slavery, might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. This is March 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery everywhere immediately had already been approved by 2/3 of both houses of Congress and was being sent to the states for ratification. He said each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. And what he says next is part of the reason why this speech has been considered such a magnificent achievement. He wrote, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. He's here referring to Southerners who invoke God to defend slavery. But clearly he's willing to acknowledge that it's unclear whose side God is on. But let us judge not, that we not be judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. Lincoln would later tell an associate, Thurlow Weed, that this was in some effect the most important part of the speech, the one where he pointed out to people that human purpose is different than God's purpose, and no human can claim to know God's will. He says it here explicitly. The Almighty has his own purposes. And he calls slavery an offense, which God has decreed. He says that if God now wills to remove that offense, that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Now Lincoln has delved deeper into theology, and he is evoking God in a way that he hasn't quite done yet. That's why some people call this speech a sermon. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, he says in the next sentence, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. And then he says something which I think in a different context could have come from the pen of John Brown in 1859. Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This is the sermon. This is the remission of sin through the shedding of blood. This is what John Brown had talked about at Harper's Ferry. This is one element of the second inaugural. It has several elements. This is not the element we best remember. We tend to focus in the modern era on the very last paragraph, the one that begins next, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. But that earlier paragraph, the one just before it, suggests that even though there's no malice involved in Southerners, the hardship of war is something that there's no apology for. It's both God's will and human will. Lincoln says, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, for his widow and his orphans, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It's a stirring conclusion. It's on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial. It expresses a great deal about Lincoln's values and beliefs, and it offers a fitting kind of framework to understand what Lincoln thought was so astounding about a war that had become not just a fight to restore the Union, but was to restore a union of people that was committed to the immediate abolition of slavery, something he did not expect in 1861, but which had become the result of the frictions and abrasions of the conflict by 1865.